morning, everybody. Okay, so first off, if I go flying across the stage, it does not end up on some blooper reel somewhere, because a special good morning as well to all those out in TV land who are lying on their beds and chewing on their ginger candies right now and just praying for this to be over. And apparently this is a beautiful, calm day, so my first crossing, so it's still kind of whoa, but anyways. So a couple things before we start. So I work with an incredibly intelligent team of people who know so much about ice and about marine mammals and about rocks and about birds. Oh my gosh, the birds. I don't know anything about any of that stuff. My first degree was political science and history, so thank God finally get to talk about something that I actually know a little bit about, so much more back in my comfort zone. And second thing, before I change the screen, I do apologize in advance to my Aussie and Kiwi friends out there. I know I've seen the globes around the ship. I know we're at the top of the world right now. I know we're not at the bottom, but this is a very northern hemispheric cruise, and it would be very confusing if I said the condominium at the top of the world, because we would all be thinking Arctic. So we got to clear those things up first. And of course, we have to clear this up first. As a political sciencey person, I love condominiums, but I am definitely not talking about these condominiums at all today. I don't think we saw anything like this on our trip, but I do have a surprise for you at the end of the lecture about condominiums. So we're talking about a political condominium. When we talk about Antarctica, it's actually the closest we can get to understanding how Antarctica is governed, because it isn't actually a true condominium, unfortunately. Now, you might be familiar with a couple of condominiums. You may have heard of this one in particular, the condominium after the end of World War II, when the Soviet Union, the United States of America, Great Britain, and France each occupied a zone of former Germany and worked together for a couple of years as an actual condominium. There was two condominiums. There was one for each of the main sectors, and then of course in the upper right-hand side there, those four little colors, which was Berlin, which was a separate condominium. And fun fact about that, that condominium actually lasted until Great Germany reunificated in 1990. So they actually had to have that 4+2 conferences at the end of the 1980s because technically, legally, the United States, Russia, France, and Germany were still in control of Berlin itself. They weren't allowed to vote in West German elections. A lot of people thought they were part of West Germany, but it was a separate entity. So that was probably the condominium that most people are familiar with. This is one of my favorite condominiums, and I'm a big fan of condominiums. So this is a cute little condominium, Morinette, and it was between Belgium, originally part of the Netherlands up until 1830, and Prussia, and then which later became the German Empire. And this little triangle here, at its maximum width, was only 1.5 kilometers wide, 5 kilometers long. So after the end of the Battle of Waterloo and the Treaty of Vienna in 1815, there was a zinc mine there. And they couldn't decide on who would be in charge of that. And so they decided to make it a condominium. So it was controlled together by both the Prussian and the later Germany and by Belgium. And that lasted until 1921, until all the dust had settled after World War I and all the treaties after that. In fact, the last citizen of this little tiny triangle, she died in 2020 at the age of 105 years old. So it was a really interesting little sort of no man's land where it kind of had rules from both countries. So that's what condominiums are. It's when countries jointly occupy something. There's a very famous condominium happening right now, and it's been happening for many, many years, and that's the Moselle River in between Germany and Luxembourg. They jointly control all the islands in the river. They jointly control the 15 bridges that cross the islands. And most importantly for people like to travel, especially for Europeans who love to travel much easier now, is they control a little tip of an island called Schengen Island, and that's where they met and signed the treaty in the 1990s that allowed for the free movement of people. And one of my other favorites, it's so hard to pick a favorite condominium, eh? I mean, they're all so much fun. But another one that I just absolutely love is this one, in English, Pheasants Island. So this is the island. This little tiny thing right here, this little tiny island. So this is Spain on one side. There's a little bit of France on the other side. And a treaty was signed here in 1659. And they decided as part of that treaty to end a war between France and Spain that they would make this island a condominium. So it is a true condominium. It's the smallest one in the world. And so how it works is for the first 6 months of the year, Spain is in control of the island. And for the second 6 months, France is in control. So France is in control for another month until they give it up again. You're not allowed to go onto the island. Only military people and civil servants go on once a month to do a little gardening, apparently, on the island. But that's about it. So these amazing condominiums around the world. Now, again, Antarctica, not a true condominium, because if, like for the Pheasants Island, for example, they both legally own it. So kind of like everybody owns Antarctica, and yet nobody owns Antarctica. But when you look at a map of Antarctica, well, you might see, I know when Kelly was up here talking about the difference between East and West Antarctica, and we see the names of some lands on here, Marie Byrd Land over here, Princess Elizabeth Land, Queen Maud Land up here at the top. Then we can add another map in now, and now we have those same lands, but now we've added in all of these bases, and some of them seem to be in different languages. And then we can get to a National Geographic map from the 1960s. This is the same map that's on one of the tables in EC if you want to take a closer look at it after. And now we see all these flags on here as well, including the old USSR flag over here. Flags everywhere, lots of information on it. So, like, what's going on? How does it that nobody owns it, yet there's all these flags on? So I remember my parents' Reader's Digest atlas when I was a kid. I loved looking through it. And one of the things that fascinated me was how are they dividing up land? And I remember the picture of the Arctic area and how all these lines went everywhere. And this has changed so much since I was a kid as well. In the early 20th century, they got into the idea of what they called the sector principle when it came to the poles. This thing up there, the sector principle. And that was the idea that from the poles, you would just draw straight lines down to the countries that are adjoining it. Canada was actually the first country in 1925 to say, we're going to invoke the sector principle. So above Ellesmere Island here, between Greenland, we're going to have a straight line going up to the pole, and we're going to do the same thing on the other side between the Yukon and Alaska. The USSR, Soviet Union, followed suit the following year, but Norway, Denmark on behalf of Greenland, and the United States never agreed to the idea of the sector principle. It has since been abandoned, as we can see here. We have some areas like even Canada, the United States, we have a definitive line, but just up to here, and then Canada, the United States can't decide between the border as well. So the sector principle, first being adopted on the other side of the world, actually, was in the bottom of the world, or the top, depending on where you're from. And this is a map I remember seeing in that Reader's Digest Atlas. Some beautiful lines on there, some nice borders. This one looks pretty nice and neat. We get onto one here now, and something a little confusing over here because we have claims. We've got these words on here now, and there's some dotted lines on there. And then up there at the top, now we see some actual clearer sections, but again, we've got some issues there with the United Kingdom, Argentina, and Chile. And if we look at the Norway one, the lines look a little bit different than the other sections. And then we can, of course, I love flags so much, so let's add some flags in as well. And then we have this whole section over here that says unclaimed with this really weird-looking flag on here too. So what is going on? How did all this happen? And so it has to do with this whole idea that went back to the first time explorers were going out. Is the first time I step on land, I've discovered it. It's my land now. I claim it on behalf of the country that I'm from. And with Antarctica, it got very, very, very confusing. Because, of course, at first they weren't even sure what was there. Some people believed that there would be open water all the way to the South Pole, or that it would just be ice like it was at the North Pole. Other people believed that there was a huge continent, and we needed that continent. Going back to Greek times, there was a belief that you had to have a ginormous, all this green area here, Terra Australis. You have to have this to balance out all the land in the North Hemisphere. You have to have something similar in the Southern Hemisphere. So here's the Northern Hemisphere here. Here's the Southern Hemisphere. We can't just have a big empty space. There's got to be this huge, huge piece of land on there. And that's one of the things that Captain Cook was looking for in his voyages, especially his second voyage from 1772 to 1775. And he got pretty darn close to actually finding Antarctica. The closest he got was 71 degrees 10 degrees south, 71 degrees 10 minutes south in 1774 at the end of January. He was approximately 80 kilometers or 50 miles away from the coastline, but he was just blocked by too much ice. But what he and his team noticed in that ice, they were seeing a lot of pieces of rock. And of course, like some of the icebergs that we have seen with those rocks coming off in those terminal moraines. And so they deduced that there must be land out there somewhere. But sailing, as you can see with his lines here, sailing all the way around, he did prove at least that there wasn't something like this. There must be land somewhere down here closer to the South Pole, but it can't be something like this. So he didn't actually discover it. What he discovered is that there's going to be something there still waiting to be discovered. And it took quite a few decades before we get to the actual discovery of the Antarctic. Now, the discovery of land down here actually happened in probably 1819 with a Captain Smith. He was in charge of a ship called the Williams, and they got blown off course. They were coming from Atlantic Ocean. They were going around the Drake to Valparaiso, and they got kind of blown off course, very far off course. And he discovered probably Livingston Island and King George Island and claimed those in 1819. But the problem was he was a civilian, so he can't actually claim land. So they sent another expedition down the following year. But in the meantime, the word of Captain Cook's adventures were starting to really get people thinking about actually trying to find the land. And so we had first a Russian, Fabian von Bellenhausen. There's a sea named after him now. Now, the sad thing about this guy is he's now usually regarded as the person that first saw the Antarctic continent itself, here in the peninsula that we have just visited, on the 28th of January of 1820. But unfortunately, his work wasn't translated for years, and when it was translated very poorly. So most people believe that he saw ice, possibly thought he saw land, but then dismissed it. And so his claim was put aside for a long time, and instead Edward Bransfield, a British, who was sent down specifically to investigate that land that the Williams ships had seen the year before. He also first saw land here on January the 30th, 1820. So 2 days after Bellenhausen, Edward Bransfield saw land and claimed it on behalf of the UK. So for decades and decades, most people believe that he was the discoverer of the Antarctic continent. It's only since the 1950s and 60s when the Soviet Union, in order to try to push their claim to Antarctica, were doing a more thorough investigation. Now, many Americans disregard both of these claims and believe it was actually Nathaniel Palmer in November of that year, that these two guys didn't actually see actual land or didn't actually, they saw islands instead, and that it was Nathaniel Palmer that was the first to discover the Antarctic Peninsula. So there's a bit of a discrepancy of who actually discovered, and any one of these people that did it, they didn't actually claim it, they just thought they all saw it. And of course, part of the discovery process, according to tradition, was that you have to land on it as well. So we think now that a ship called the Cecilia, a sealing vessel, came ashore in 1821 on the actual peninsula itself at a place called Hughes Bay. But we didn't know anything about that because the family of the captain found his logs in the 1950s. So it wasn't until the early 1960s, after doing a thorough investigation of his logs, to think that, okay, maybe they were the first ones to actually come ashore. So that way they would be claiming it for perhaps the United States. However, the first documented case of somebody actually landing, disregarding the 1821 one, wasn't until 1895, which I find absolutely incredible. That's not that long ago, I think, in our history there, that it was the Southern Cross on the other side, just at the entrance here to the Ross Sea. In 1895, the first confirmed landing for decades. So now we've got people that say they discovered. Now we've got people that said that they've landed there. And so now the process is that we've got to stake our claim. And by staking our claim, you got to name things. The more you name things, the more of a right you have to something. That's the traditional belief when it comes to some countries. We don't follow these rules anymore, of course, but that was the feeling back then. And then it got very, very confusing because you have competing nations all trying to name something. And of course, they're going to give things different names. And just where we were is a great example of that. So we said that we did our continental landing at Portal Point up there on the Antarctic Peninsula. But the Antarctic Peninsula as a name hasn't been around for that long, only about 60 years now, because up until the 1960s, if you were from the United Kingdom, you called it Graham Land. If you were from the US, you called it Palmer Peninsula after Nathaniel Palmer. It's still to this day, if you're from Chile, it's Tierra O'Higgins after the first president of Chile, and Tierra de San Martin after the liberator from the Spanish in Argentina. And it wasn't until 1964, as we see from this New York Times article, so 60 years ago now, that the United States and Britain at least agreed on a common name. They each have their own Antarctic place name committees with slightly different names, and they started getting together in the 1960s to try to find common ground on a lot of these names. And other countries, though, disregard that. So I know in Daily Briefing the other day, we saw a map that was in Spanish, and so it gave this name for for the peninsula, and then it put Antarctic Peninsula in brackets in English underneath. And even one of our stops that we made, we had to go briefly into this our bay here in King George Island. So this is where we were, and we went on this lovely little SOB ride in there. It also doesn't have the same name depending on the language. So it has been decided on King George Island in English for English-speaking countries. Chile just translates it directly into Spanish, Isla Rey Jorge, but Argentinians refer to it as 25th of May for Independence Day, and the Russians call it Waterloo or Waterloo instead. So countries, to help to strengthen their claim, once they name something, they're very hesitant to give up that name because that could take their possession of something away. So this is where we stand now. We've got people that said we have seen it first. We have people that said we have landed on it first. We have people that say that we have named things first. And then we get into the very confusing part of those slides I showed you with all those little pieces of pie with all those beautiful colors. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the seven nations, the 7 countries that believe that they actually have territorial claims. To this day, there are countries that believe that we own a part of Antarctica. And we'll start off with the biggest one, the United Kingdom, because at one point the United Kingdom was pretty much ready to lay claim to the entire continent. It's all of ours. So an old map here from 1886 shows 3 areas, and there's been very little investigations done of Antarctica at that time, but even with what little information they had, Graham Land up here, which is the Antarctic Peninsula, the area around what's now called the Ross Sea, they called Victoria Land, and Wilkes Land up along the coast. So we have New Zealand over here and then Australia closest to Wilkes Land. So as they did more and more investigations, and again trying to name everything as fast as they can, they were especially trying to make the best possible naval charts that they could. And to this day, most people agree that the British naval charts are the best in Antarctica, especially along the Antarctic Peninsula and around the Ross Sea as well. So they're going like crazy trying to name things, trying to map things. And then along comes this guy, Leo Amery, in the 1920s, and he's the guy that says, okay, we're going to claim the whole thing. Unfortunately, the French, which we'll get to in a moment, had a little tiny claim as well, too, so then he kind of changed his mind. Okay, we're going to claim everything except for this little sliver that the French have. So the Brits had already decided in 1908 that the area around the Antarctic Peninsula, they were incorporated into a territory that included the Falkland Islands, South Georgia Island, other South Orkney Islands. In 1917, they invoked the sector principle for the first time, where they said any land that we own all the way to the pole. And then Leo comes along and says, okay, now we're going to actually try to claim the whole thing. So in 1923, they had an order in council. It never got past the order in council stage, though, so it never actually took effect, but they did claim huge, huge, huge swaths of land. The territory itself that we saw on that map earlier and that we see on this one here, which includes the entire Antarctic Peninsula and the whole Weddell Sea just to the right of it, it was actually made its own separate territory in 1962. So it was only a couple of years ago that they had a commemorative coin to celebrate that special anniversary. And the work that the Brits do down here along the peninsula, it's mostly self-funded. Does anybody have any idea of where they get all their money to pay for everything down here? From the stamps that you folks all bought, exactly. That's where it's a mostly self-funded. Those folks at Port Lockroy, they're there for a reason, and that helps to actually pay for a lot of the work they do in Antarctica. And when the young woman was up on stage talking about their conservation work as well, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing that they're doing, the original idea of doing conservation work on the buildings in Antarctica by the British, by the Argentinians, by the Chileans, especially here in the peninsula, by the Australians over in Wilkland, it wasn't so much that, oh, we have this wonderful heritage, we want to preserve it. But if we preserve this, this helps to prove that we were here first. So that's the whole reason that they started preserving buildings down here, started saying that anything that anyone had touched was a historical site. You know, you have that, we saw a couple of little bits of old whaling ships sticking out. If someone's able to prove where that whaling ship came from, we were here first at that spot, because that's what this whole discovery and territorial claim is all about. Now, I said that Leo wanted the entire continent, and we only have this one little piece up there, that one little pink piece going to Great Britain, but there was much more territory that Great Britain had originally claimed. They just sort of shared it with a couple of their very close friends, including Australia. So Australia inherited this claim in 1933 from the United Kingdom. And we see that one little weird strip of grey land in between, and that's the French claim that we'll talk about in a moment. So the Australia claim is huge. It's almost 47% of the entire continent. And it's so large that the Australian government has divided it into different sectors. There's an actual division of the government that runs the Australia Antarctic Territory. So the Australian Antarctic Program runs it. They have a specially designed ship, the Nunya, which is an indigenous word for Southern Lights, which is specifically designed out of Hobart, Tasmania, to support the work that they do in their territory. Their largest station is Mawson Station, named after Douglas Mawson, probably, I wouldn't even say arguably, he is the most important Antarctic explorer from Australia. And it's been in existence since the early 1950s. And like many other countries, like the UK does, and not just to raise money, but to show that you own something, you issue stamps from that place. So that's a really big part of these territorial claims, is having these stamps, having them postmarked at a post office on the peninsula, at Mawson Station, at wherever, and the idea is that helps to enforce your claim. So that's another little sneaky thing those British people were doing. They got you to buy those stamps and stuff like that. In a way, we're saying, hey, look at this is British territory down there. Don't worry, you're not legally bound to that or anything like that, but it is something that they do to help to promote their claim. So the other piece of land that the United Kingdom gave away, which was to another Commonwealth country, and that was to New Zealand. New Zealand has the second smallest land claim now in Antarctica, because most of what their claim is the Ross Sea here at the other side of the continent from where we are. So very small claim. So the Governor General, who represents the monarch in New Zealand, like we do in Canada as well, became the governor of this territory in 1923, and then like with Australia, it was officially given to New Zealand in 1933. Their major base there is Scott Base, and it's right beside McMurdo Base. So the United States and Australia and New Zealand work very closely together. The Scott Base is much, much smaller. They actually rely on the United States a lot, and they have this sort of deal that, okay, we say it's our territory, but we're not going to enforce any rules or anything when it comes to you, the Americans, as long as you keep helping us get our stuff over there. So they've issued their own stamps as well, and they've been doing that since the early 1960s. They also have a specially designed ship to help to support their Antarctic adventures, but again, they do rely much more on the Americans as well. Tragically, with the New Zealand claim, and this ties into a little bit about tourism as well, in the 1970s, once people realized that no one really owns Antarctica, so we can kind of do whatever we want. Some people started different tourist operations, which really got carried away into the 1980s. Now, New Zealand was one of those countries, but it had a territorial claim, and it started to offer sightseeing flights from New Zealand just down to the Ross Sea area and back. So it's not like you landed or anything, you just went on a little sightseeing flight. Very tragically, on November 28th of 1979, one of the flights was flying, and something happened with the computer and it miscalculated where they were going, and they crashed into the side of Mount Erebus, the active volcano that Kelly talked about the other day. And all the crew and the passengers, 257 people on board, were killed instantly in that. And that stopped any kind of flights like that. So New Zealand is much more low-key about it. And in fact, New Zealand is the one, if any country was going to raise their hand and said, you know, we're okay with this not owning part of Antarctica, it would be New Zealand. They're the ones that have been most sort of hesitant. They arguably have put the least amount of money and time into Antarctica compared to the other claimant nations. And then we have that little tiny sliver I talked about there, and that's France. So France it's got a different kind of map because technically, according to France, that little sliver is not just a territory within itself, but it's part of all the southern islands as well that France claims in the Indian and Southern Ocean. The name of the claimant comes from this man here, Jules Sébastien Dumont d'Urville. Now, he was a bit of a character. He was looking for some real fame and fortune. He was hired by the French government to take a trip in 1838, more about the Pacific, but he was hoping to deep down and do some discoveries in the Southern Ocean as well, too. He wasn't very successful on his first run. He was here on the Antarctic Peninsula in 1839. He did name an island, Joinville Island, at the top of the peninsula. Then he had to go do his work in the South Pacific. He got to Hobart for the season to do some repairs, take on new supplies, and then he wanted to go back down to the Southern Ocean. He received word in Hobart from his wife. They had 4 children, and he received word that their now 3rd child had died of a childhood disease. So the wife was at home now left with 1 child. 2 children had died before he left home. 1 child died while he was on his way. Her message was, "We've lost another child, please come home." He ignored the message completely and continued to sail south. He did discover that little bit of Antarctica. They didn't actually go ashore to the mainland. They did go on shore to a little rock, planted a French flag there, which promptly fell over because it was a rock, so they held it up, made some kind of declaration, and now this territory is ours. And he decided, well, I wasn't able to make it home, so honey, I'm going to name the territory after you. So those Adelie penguins that we talk about, those are also named after his wife. Adelie was her name, and so Terre Adelie now is the name of the French section. They have 2 bases on it. The one on the coastline is named after him, Dumont d'Urville. They're very happy with their tiny little slice of the pie. They never asked for any more than that, but they are not interested at all in giving up their claim. Something interesting I found out as well is not just about these Adelaide penguins there, but the emperor penguins that was there in the early 21st century. A beautiful movie came out called March of the Penguins. Now, I had a 7-year-old daughter at the time when this came out. I watched this movie about 50 times. I don't know much about the penguins we saw the other day, but I know a lot about emperor penguins, having seen that movie so many times. But it was actually a French movie. It was a French-produced movie. It was shot in the French sector, and it was just, they used Morgan Freeman as the voiceover for the American version. So it's not even an American movie. I always thought it was. So I just had to throw that in, because when I find something interesting, I just want to share it with the world. Much to the chagrin of most of my family. Okay, now let's go on to Norway here. So Norway got into this because of the whole whaling thing. For them, it wasn't about discovering things. It was just about whaling. And that really took off in the early 20th century. By 1931, there were 256 whaling ships around the Antarctic Peninsula, around that area at the top, which Norway has since claimed. 256 ships working in one season. The big pusher for it was this gentleman, Lars Christensen. He had taken over the shipping and whaling operation from his father. He owned this ship, the Norvegia, and they did a lot of investigating around the entire continent. But again, their primary concern was looking for whales. They laid claim to an island there called Bouvet, or Bouvet Island, and what they did, they struck a little deal. The English were also looking at that island as well, too, and so they struck a little deal because they actually wanted to make their claim going much, much more to the east, so to the right-hand side, and that overlapped with the UK/Australian claim. So what they agreed was, well, we get Bouvet Island, and we'll stick to the claim that we have. And so that was the deal that was made. And so again, it was just all about the whaling, which of course we're not allowed to do anymore since 1994 in the Southern Ocean. They have a strong research presence here now, 12 stations, including 6 stations that are open year-round, and this is their largest troll station. The big claim to fame for the Norwegian claim is, again, it's about getting boots on the ground. It's about making sure that the world sees that you're spending time here. The first reigning monarch in the world, King Harald from Norway, came to the Norwegian sector in 2015 to help to further strengthen their claim to the area as well. And we're going to see that as well with a couple other ones. It's all about getting that public publicity out there to constantly be saying that this is our land. And now we're into that part, we have to go back to the UK again, and we're into that weird part that we saw on those maps where there were different colors overlapping, because this beautiful Antarctic peninsula, the most easy to access, the area that stays ice-free for longer than the others, well, that's the one that everybody wants. So we already had the UK claim, which covers a lot of this sector, and we have the Chilean claim as well. I want to show you 2 pictures that I took a couple weeks ago in Punta Arenas. So that's the southernmost city in Chile, and this was on a plaque in one of the squares that as I was walking around. And it might be hard to read, but it says Territorio Chileno Antarctico. So and that's like on a plaque. This is part of our territory. We were at a museum with some reproductions of some famous ships, and they had this long map of Chile, which of course they have to put sideways because it's a long, skinny country. And part of the map includes this part of the Antarctic Peninsula, very definitely defined as being part of Chilean territory. It's part of the country of Chile. It's mostly thanks to this guy, Pinochet de la Barra was his last name. Chile was traditionally believed that it had a claim there, but they weren't doing much about it. Interestingly enough, some of the other expeditions in the heroic age in the early 20th century, including Scott's discovery expedition in 1901, they asked permission from Chile to come onto the Antarctic Peninsula, which Chile started to think, hey, we kind of maybe have something going here. So this guy in the 1940s, he published a very important book trying to rile up his countrymen and trying to get them excited about it. And he got one person excited, and that was the president. So, well, we had the first reigning monarch visit the Norwegian sector in 2015. It was actually President Videla in 1948 who was the first head of state to visit Antarctica and to specifically, of course, visit the Chilean sector. Now, Chile, like many other countries, has scientific bases on them. We saw quite a few of those when we were down here. But beside their largest base, where the airstrip was on King George Island, so that's Eduardo Frei is the name of the base, they have an actual, what they call a town, Villa Las Estrellas, or the City of the Stars. So that's part of their laying claim as well, too. We don't just have bases here. We have an actual town where 80 people live that have churches, that has a little supermarket. It's supposed to be a pretty sketchy supermarket from what I read. They have a little school there as well, too, and the whole idea is helping to reinforce that claim. And then you get kind of carried away sometimes trying to reinforce your claim. So in late 1983, the base commander at the Eduardo Frei base, his wife was pregnant in Chile. So the government, which was a dictatorship at the time, got this wonderful idea. We're going to fly the 7.5-month pregnant wife down to Villa Las Estrellas to give birth. And that's he's a doctor now in Chile, so he was the first Chilean born. He wasn't the only poor woman that they flew down. They flew 2 other women down as well. So 3 people from Chile gave birth in that year of 1984. So this is not the Juan Cruz that works as part of our department either. So if you see him today, don't start getting excited and think he was the first Chilean born there, because he's from Ushuaia, so he'll be very, very upset with you. So you don't want to make that mistake. So the last claim we've got is the Argentinian claim. And again, it's overlapping that peninsula, and it also very much more overlaps the British one out into the Weddell Sea here. How am I doing for time? I could talk about this for a long time, so I really have to watch my time today. Now, a couple of other pictures I took in Ushuaia when we were there last week. So this is the regional government house. So this is Government House in downtown Ushuaia on Saint Martin. And underneath it says it's the government house for Tierra del Fuego, for the Antarctic, and for the Southern Islands. So again, a belief. If you go into the tourist store right at the end of the pier, when we get to Ushuaia, there's a map on the wall. And part of that map is this huge section here, which is the Argentinian claim. So actually putting that on the map, they believe, helps to reinforce their claim. Argentina does lay claim to the oldest base. So this base here was actually started first by the Scottish National Expedition in 1902, but they turned it over to the Argentinians in 1904. It is the longest occupied piece of land in all of Antarctica. It's been occupied since that time. It's the site of the only shots ever fired in Antarctica as well. Well, except for the attempted murder, but I don't know if there were shots included in that, because there was an attempted murder in the Russian base in 2018, but I don't know enough about it to say if there were shots fired. But the Argentinian base in the early 1950s, 1952, some Brits were coming ashore to work on a little structure that they had built, and an Argentinian commander got a little excited and fired a couple of shots over their heads. There had to be a big public apology about that. So they can lay claim to the longest operating base in Antarctica, and much like Villa Las Estrellas that the Chileans have, Esperanza Base, Hope, which is in Hope Bay, is the big Argentinian sort of town there. They have a great motto. Their motto in English is permanence. It's an act of sacrifice, because they strongly believe that this helps to lay their claim to it. They have the southernmost scout troop in the world, because again, they have kids living there all year long in order to help to make that claim. And so, oh, I'm sorry, I got something mixed up. I got something very, very mixed up. So going back to the Chile one real quick, that was a mistake on my part. Juan Cruz's parents were not sent down, mother wasn't sent down heavily pregnant. That happened in the Argentinian one. This one was even worse. The Chilean one, it was a husband and wife that had just gotten married, and they were sent down to conceive, have the pregnancy, and give birth in Antarctica. So huge mistake on my part there. So Juan Cruz was the first child conceived, carried, and actually born in Antarctica. So can you imagine, like when my kids got married, you don't want to ask them, you don't want to push, but you know the question's always there. So are you thinking of starting a family? And so now these two people are sent to Antarctica, and the question from the whole country is, okay, get going, start this family. Anyways, this was the first child born in Antarctica, Emilio Palma, with the parents, and she was the one that was 7 months pregnant at the time. He was the base commander, sent down there, gave birth, and then immediately went home. The first of 9 Argentinian children that were born on the peninsula, including a couple that were born further south so that they could lay the claim that they're born closest to the South Pole. Seriously, this is what happens when you talk about Antarctic politics. That's why it's just absolutely so fascinating. And then we quickly have the United States. You'll notice that the map is kind of a little bit duller, and it involves that section there. Now, first, very quickly, Charles Wilkes led an expedition of 7 ships, I believe, traveled around the world, especially did a lot of work in Antarctica. He's kind of the guy that kind of first said, you know, I think this thing is a whole continent. I think this is an actual continent down here, and he called it Antarctica land, so in a sense named it. I'm not going to point him out or anything, but we have a gentleman in the audience whose great, I hope I've got that right, grandfather was on this expedition, was part of this, which I think is absolutely amazing. Now, for many Americans, it's Richard Byrd, who's the big guy when it comes to Antarctic expeditions. He, of course, was the first one to fly over the South Pole. Unfortunately, to the chagrin of the government, he dropped flags from the window of all the countries that were in Antarctica. They wanted him just to drop American flags down, but he didn't. This is him in later years because he became the go-to guy when it came to Antarctica. He developed a series of bases called Little America 1 through 5, and those bases were the first bases that were actually had the idea that we're here permanently. So they had recreation facilities, they had better sleeping quarters than others did. Got into the stamp game as well, as everyone has to do. That's super important. But the Americans can really thank the fact that they don't have a claim to President Eisenhower. So the reason that that section is kind of dimmed out, it's Mary Byrd land, so Richard Byrd named it for his wife, but no one has ever claimed it. A lot of people wanted the Americans to claim it. Many members of Congress in the 1950s, the National Security Council urged Eisenhower to claim it, but he was worried that it would lead to Soviet Union counterclaims. So he very wisely, most historians believe, did not pursue any claims, which helped to keep things much more peaceful down there. It's not something that's often mentioned in his biographies, the work that he did with Antarctica, but it was very, very important. Okay, I'm in big trouble here. Okay, so now we got to go even faster because now we're after World War II, and so now people are getting really interested in Antarctica for its strategic, for its mineral, perhaps for its oil. We have Operation High Jump after World War II. It involved 12 major vessels, 32 different types of aircraft, and 4,700 men all traveling here to start to set up bases and start to get sort of, not a territorial claim, but kind of like, we're in this spot, this is our spot kind of thing. Operation Deep Freeze, it got underway in 1956, and that's where the major bases, like the base that's actually at the South Pole, McMurdo base, were all built. And again, not pointing out anyone, but there's someone in the audience that's wearing a really nice red hat that was part of Operation Deep Freeze, whose great-great-great-grandfather was on that expedition with Charles Wilkes. So it's an honor for me to present to someone that actually knows this stuff and who should really be up on stage with the mic. I asked him, but he wouldn't listen to me. Now, we also have Operation Terror, and that was the United Kingdom's secret plan during World War II. So as soon as the war is over, to start doing more on the Antarctic Peninsula to stake that claim to save off the Chileans and the Argentinians from getting too involved in that section. And of course, we mentioned the Russians before, so the Russians started a series of bases from the coast working their way inland, one of them being Vostok, which I just love, because can you believe that temperature? Wouldn't that be amazing? Just to say that you were there for that, like that would be, I think that would be pretty awesome. Now, in 1948, the United States suggested that because of, after World War II, of course, decolonization, the United Nations had started up a trusteeship council, and they suggested that the trusteeship council should take over Antarctica. All those claimants, those 7 claimants, all said, that's not happening, except for one. New Zealand. They're like, okay, that sounds great to us, please take this off our hands. But if no one else was going to blink, New Zealand wasn't going to blink as well, too. And then we get to this super important year. The International Geophysical Year started in 1957. The idea was it was at one of those 11 years where the sun activity is at its peak. And so it was scientists around the world, 67 different nations working. This is their emblem here. And they were working all around the world, but they really wanted to focus on Antarctica. So that's why the globe is kind of tilted so that you can see the South Pole. United States and the USSR, this is really getting close to the height of the Cold War. I think just a few years from now is going to be the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we have these scientists working together in Antarctica. Countries, like I said, 67 countries from around the world worked in this. 12 different countries set up bases around Antarctica to do geophysical studies as well. And it's when the United States really got going on their bases here in Antarctica. So it was a huge, huge effort by all these scientists. And what it led to was a sense of cooperation. So Dwight Eisenhower harnessed that, and he helped to foster something which we now call the Antarctic Treaty. We have 3 sort of circles of flags on there. The middle circle are those 12 original countries, the ones that had the bases in 1957-58. They were original signatories of the treaty. Around that, we have a second circle of countries that have since joined the treaty. And then we have a circle of observer states, ones that aren't actually formally part of the treaty, but are still part of it. And it was thanks to Ike and also thanks to this man, Paul Daniels, who was able to get those 7 claimant nations, able to get the USSR, able to get the United States all together to make this deal. And what did they agree? Well, they agreed on a lot of stuff. Number 1, no nuclear weapons, no nuclear testing. Military activities are only to support science on there. You're not allowed to actually do any kind of testing or military presence for the sake of military. And the really important upper right-hand corner, all territorial claims in Antarctica will be on hold. So that was really important. We're not saying that nobody owns it. You can still think that you own it, but we're just putting all that on hold. And that was ratified in 1961. So it's been going now for 63 years. They've been able to keep that going. And currently we have all of those countries, like I said, that are either original signatories, have bases on there and have since ratified the treaty, or just want to be part of the process as well. So it's that scientific collaboration which has really worked to help to bring all these countries together to deal with a really thorny issue of who owns Antarctica. 1972 signed the agreement to outlaw any type of seal hunting, followed in 1980 by the agreement for all marine life in what is now called the Southern Ocean. And very importantly, in 1991 was the environmental protocols, because at the time, most of the nations were just dumping their stuff either out on the snow or right into the ocean. And so like we've noticed on how careful we are with the environment in Antarctica, that really started thanks to these scientific agreements, thanks to the Antarctic Treaty. So what does it mean for currently? Well, Antarctica has its own top-level domain when it comes to the internet. That's the French version of Antarctique. And so AQ, if you see anything that ends in AQ, well, that is a top-level domain, and it's only given for free to either countries or to organizations that have an actual physical presence in Antarctica. Of course, that the Antarctic Treaty led to the creation of the IATO Treaty, which we're all very familiar with this symbol, having seen it on our jackets. You are all Antarctic ambassadors now, and that's about sustainable and responsible tourism, and that's all thanks to these nations agreeing to work together. I love this biggest growth in countries coming to, and the number one biggest growth is Canada, 121%, because that's probably there were 4 people coming before, and now there's 8 people coming, or 9, or whatever it is. So this is a cool idea. So people are starting to think now, how can we get more people involved? Some people still want it to be turned into a world park. Some people think that the United Nations should administer it. Somebody came up with the idea is, why don't we do this? Why don't we just draw a straight line straight north from Antarctica, and the first piece of land they hit, those countries are the ones that get to be part of the process here. And you can see how many countries would be involved in there, and the USA would actually end up with a huge chunk thanks to Alaska, especially thanks to the Alaska Peninsula. Now, the Antarctic Treaty isn't going along tickety-boo. Of course, geopolitics gets in the way here, too. So both Russia and China have recently made some moves that are disturbing to other members of it as well. But to end on a little more quirky note, so since nobody technically owns Antarctica and the treaty only applies to country, there are some interesting people out there in the world that believe in these things called micronations, which I'm also very fascinated with, like condominiums. And these are people that think that they own countries because they find little loopholes in treaties and things. So it all started in 2001 with a guy named Travis. So Travis is now Grand Duke Travis. Now, I have no problem with the name Travis. I have a cousin who's named Travis, but I don't think of Grand Duke when I think of Travis. So Travis laid claim to that whole Mary Bird land, the unclaimed part of it, what he now calls West Arctica, and he is one of 27 people who believe that they own part of Antarctica. The most recent one just happened this year. I don't even know how to pronounce the name of this. It's one island off the top of Antarctica. It's a guy from the Netherlands that says he owns it. This is the 3rd time he's tried to start a micronation. I loved on his website, he gives the gender profile of the country. It's 100% male because he's the only person that lives there. So it says underneath that he's hoping to diversify the gender imbalance in there. His claim to fame is that he used artificial intelligence to write the Constitution. So it's the first national constitution that's been written thanks to artificial intelligence. So when you get home, check the treaty out. Maybe there's a loophole. You've had your little piece of paradise now here. Maybe there's a little piece left for you that you can end up owning as well, because we all own it and nobody owns it. And that's what makes Antarctica so cool. But when you do go home and you want to learn more about the condominium thing in Antarctica, please do not just Google condo in Antarctica, because this is literally what you're going to get if you Google condo in Antarctica. So I would just love to check in and check out on a certain date. I'm looking for 3 rooms for a party of 6. What am I going to get? And I love some of the views, too. The views are fantastic from there as well, too. So remember, you want to Google condominium, political condominium in Antarctica. Please do not Google this. Folks, I am way over time, so thank you so much for joining me. Enjoy the rest of your time on the ship. If you have any questions, come down and find me here. Thank you so much.